I didn't introduce myself earlier on, and that was very remiss of me. My name is Dave, and I'm one of the ministers here at Gold Hill, and it's my privilege to share with you something from God's Word this morning. If you do not have a Bible with you, then do put your hand up, because it'd be great for you to follow along. I can see a couple of hands, that'd be great. The welcome team will be coming around with those. And if you are using a church Bible, then the passage we're looking at this morning is found on page 140. Page 140. If you're using your own Bible, you're going to have to work it out for yourself. We're carrying on our journey through the book of Deuteronomy this morning. We started that last week, and if you didn't pick up one of these little booklets that has a guide to the series and lots of notes and study notes and questions and reading plans and different things that you can use, then please do grab one from the back on the way out, or put your hand up and one of the stewards, one of the welcome team will be able to bring one for you now. Our whole series is called Choose Life. It's a phrase from the book of Deuteronomy, and it's all about the people of God as they stand at a turning point in their lives, making a choice about the way they're going to live. There's a hand over here. Sue's got her hand up. Making a choice about how it is they're going to live. Are they going to live in line with God's ways, or are they not? As they make this massive step into the promised land, how is their life going to look? Are they going to be people who are for God, or people who are a little bit half-baked? And last week we were looking at the importance of remembering the story so far, choosing to remember God's faithfulness, choosing to remember, yes, the times when we failed, so that we can remember how good God has been, choosing to remember God's promises, and choosing to remember our purpose. And today we come to something which could be a bit of a heavy word, the word obedience. Today we come to this idea of choosing to obey. Now, obedience is something which we've had some fun with this morning. We've talked about different people that we might obey and we might not to. But actually, the choice to obey someone is a huge choice. And it's something which carries great significance. So we're going to look at what that meant for the people and what that might mean for us. So let me read. We're looking at 9 verses from Deuteronomy chapter 4. If you'd like to read with me. Not out loud though, please. Starting at verse 1 of Deuteronomy 4. So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I'm teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I'm charging you. You've seen for yourselves what the Lord did with regard to the Baal of Peor, how the Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal of Peor, while those of you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. See, just as the Lord my God has charged me, I now teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you're about to enter and occupy. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I'm setting before you today? But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. And then Moses carries on, but we're going to depart from him there. So when we think about obedience, I want to set out a working definition of what obedience is. And it is this. It is the whole of us keeping the whole law to show the whole of God to the world. 3 points. Three aspects to obedience. The whole of us keeping the whole law to show the whole of God to the world. You'll see it up on my side. I've been told that last week I looked a little bit like a weather presenter, sort of pointing to the relevant parts. I'm not going to try and aim very well, but you can follow along on the screen as well. The whole of us keeping the whole law to show the whole of God to the world. So what does it mean for obedience to take the whole of us? Well, in these verses, we see a few phrases which sort of point us in that direction. You'll see in verse 1 that the people are told to give heed and to observe the statutes that they're given. In verse 2, to keep these laws. In verse 4, it talks about people who have held fast to these laws. You can move on to the next slide, Angela. And this is all of these words are about our doing. All of these words are about us being diligent and being careful in the way that we go about keeping the law, or the people of Israel doing that. This phrase, give heed, with which Moses starts this. The word, if you unpack it, it means to listen, it means to hear, it means to obey. It's the whole process that someone goes through when they're given a command, from hearing it, to understanding it, to putting it into action. It's one word because it should be one action. This hearing and doing. Hearing and doing. It's not hearing, mulling on, and then we'll come up with a new verb for the bit where we actually follow through on it. For Israel, to be told to give heed to these is both to be attentively listening and to be actively doing these things. It's about an immediate response and about a consistent response. And it's the law that God gives that they're meant to do this with. They're meant to hear it and put it into practice. Now, when we think about the things in our lives, and we've heard an example of a number of them this morning already, the things that we are obedient to in one way or another, the reality is that in one way or another, we have to filter those things. My parents are here this morning. Hi, Mum. Hi, Dad. And there was a time in my life when I was called to be obedient to them. Some would argue I'm still in that time of my life now. Two of them maybe this morning. But when I was a child, I had to obey what they told me. That was right. That was good. That's God's plan for parenting. That's God's plan for family. Now, the truth is, though, if they had told me, and they never did, if they had told me to do something that was absolutely despicable, if they'd said, can you watch out while I go and steal something from this shop? If they told me, go and bully that child at school because he's not good for anything. If they told me something like that, there should have been, they never did, there should have been a warning light in my head going, no, 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 this is wrong. This is wrong. How do I know that's wrong? Well, I was part of a church family. I knew some of what the Bible had taught me, but I just knew. I would have known that those things were wrong. And so when they said those things to me, my response should have been, no, that's not right. Does that mean I'm not obedient to my parents? No. It means that I have to filter those things through the lens of what I know to be right and what I know to be wrong. The same is true when our employers give us an instruction. The same is true when our government tells us things. The same is true when our friends or our society or our peer group tells us things. When the world gives us a message or an instruction, we are rightly meant to filter those things. The question is, against what? Where does our authority come from? Because for the people of God who are stood here, hearing these laws, there was no need to filter what God was saying to them, because it was coming from a reliable and a trustworthy source. I'll come back to that idea in a moment, because we've talked about our actions obeying the law, and that's sort of hearing and immediately obeying. Yes, that's good. But then there's something else for the people of God here, that it's not just about their sort of external doing as if they're acting like robots. Look in verse 9. We read, "But take care and watch yourselves closely." That phrase, watch yourself closely, could be perhaps more accurately translated as guard your souls as you go about keeping these laws. This is not just about an external compliance when we're given an instruction. This is about our hearts being changed from the inside, about our souls being captured by what God has asked us to do. Bye, Michael. By our souls being captured, so captivated by who God is and what he's instructed, that our outward actions end up flowing from it. This isn't just about following a bunch of rules. This is about having ourselves changed. Watch yourself closely so you don't forget these things. Because the truth is that unlike parents, unlike employers, unlike governments, unlike all of those things, God is completely trustworthy. God is the one who we never have to filter his commands. We never have to filter his instructions. Why? Because he is perfect. And when he says something, it is right. If something else flies in the face of it, it is that thing that is wrong. And so our souls, as they come to know and love God more, as we are shaped more by him, as we watch ourselves closely to make sure we're living in step with him, it starts to flow from the inside out. We love God. It's not that we love the laws, it's that we love God enough to be shaped and know that the law is right, so that we want to live by it. Moses is, on the one hand, saying, when you hear, obey. And on the other hand, he's saying, come to love these things because they are good for you. The same journey is an important one for us. But then it's not just about our actions and our hearts and our souls, because there's other words involved. Again, look in verse 9. So as neither to forget these things, nor to let them slip from your mind, make them known to your children and your children's children. This is something about our minds being shaped, our minds being transformed by the law, about knowing what it is that God has said is right and what God has said is wrong. As we grow in our journey with God, as we are shaped more by him, we can rely or trust a little bit more what it is that we know, because our minds should be being shaped by him. We've come to know who God is and what he's commanding, and so we can trust our thinking a little bit more, so long as we're being diligent about it, so long as we're being careful to make sure we're being shaped so that things don't slip from our mind. So long as we are making them known to one another, to our children and our children's children, forging a community where we are constantly reminding each other of how God has asked us to be, of how God has asked us to live. Obedience is not just about following a bunch of rules. Obedience is not like the highway code where we just have to make sure we keep in line with a certain bunch of things. Obedience is about having our whole beings shaped by God so that we're living in line with his ways. Where does that start, though? Well, very soon after this, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, in a passage we're not actually going to look at on a Sunday morning, Moses reminds the people of the Ten Commandments. He reminds the people of those 10 big commandments, those 10 big statutes that are found in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And he reminds people of them. And then he goes on to explain them a little bit. And actually, if you look over the whole of the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, you can see that really it's unpacking one by one each of those commandments. It sort of elaborates and explores what it means. He doesn't just repeat those 10 commandments and have done with it. He's saying these 10 commandments, as you step into this new phase, as you step into the promised land, this is what they need to look like. We're going to be doing something similar on our website over the next couple of weeks. Monday to Friday this week and Monday to Friday the next week. That's 10 days, 10 commandments. We're going to be posting an article that we've written, which is talking about the commandment, each of those commandments one by one, and then talking about what does it mean to live by those today? In real terms, what does it mean to live by those commandments today? If you want to make sure you follow along with that, then it'll all be on our social media and things, but also check out goldhill.org/Deuteronomy because it'll all be posted up there. So we have to know a little bit of what it is that God is asking us to do. We can't just hope that we'll pick it up in the ether. We have to commit to what God's laws are. We have to ask him, what are you asking me to be obedient to? And we have to understand what that means for us. But there's another place that it starts. And it's with a question. Are you willing to behave differently if God asks you to? Are we willing to actually change something about our lives if God asks us to? Or are there parts of our life that are actually off limits? Where we say, no, that bit's staying put. That bit's not changing. You're not having any part of that, God. That bit's mine. If that's true of us, it means that there is part of our life that is not obedient. It means that there's something over which we are not willing to move because actually we've said that thing is more important than God. That our soul is in some way shaped more by that thing than God's. I was preaching at my dad's a Baptist minister as well, and I was preaching at his church a couple of months ago. And one of the things I was saying to the church was about how much they, it's all right, you can get them after the service, how much they really want to see people come to know Jesus as a result of what they're doing. And I laid them a challenge. I said to them this: if I could show you empirical evidence that the people of Tamworth, they live in Tamworth, that the people of Tamworth would be reached better for the gospel if you painted the walls of your church building inside and out bright pink, would you do it? Now, I've got no such evidence, no such research to show them. I would hate being part of a church that met in a building that was bright pink inside and out. I would hate it. I'm sure you would too. If we knew it would make us more effective for reaching people who don't yet know Jesus, would we do it? I like the fact that a number of you have said yes. So what wouldn't you do? What wouldn't we change? What would be off limits? What about the way we meet? What about who we are? What about the way we structure ourselves? What wouldn't we change? What wouldn't we do? I'm sure that for all of us, I know that for me, there are things that I really struggle with. What are they for us? Sometimes asking those questions helps us work out where our obedience is. So we've talked about the whole of us needing to obey the law. But the reality is, it's not just about keeping some of the law. It's also about keeping all of the law. Look in verse 2. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God with which I am charging you. We can't play pick and choose. We need to respect the integrity of the law, the fact that it all holds together, the fact that it all needs the rest of it in order to make sense. This is about a whole way of being, a whole way of living. Now, we might go, yeah, I like those bits. I don't really like the bits about what God says about what I should do with my money. But I like the bits about my relationships and my life and my religious life. I like those bits, so I'll do those bits. But money, not so much. Or it might be the other way around. Money, it's fine, it's just money. I find that easy. Yeah, giving, fine, absolutely. Tithing, great. Generosity, fantastic. Got that, fine. But please don't talk to me about my sexuality. Please don't talk to me about my relationships. Please don't talk to me about my marriage or my singleness. We can't just take the bits of what God says to us. Because for the people of Israel, it was the law that Moses was about to give. We have a whole Bible. We have a whole Bible telling us about things, about the way that God wants us to live. It is very offensive in our culture to say to people, this is the way to live because God has said so. It is very offensive to say to someone, it may be even offensive to say to some of you, you cannot be the ultimate source of authority in your life if you are choosing to submit yourself to Jesus. What was it Zach said earlier on? He wants to obey God because I'm a Christian and because I want to be a disciple of Jesus. Being a disciple means to be obedient to what God is saying to us. But it doesn't just mean respecting the integrity of the whole law, because let's be honest, it's a bit more complicated than that. In verse 1, he doesn't just talk about the ordinances that I am giving you, he talks about the ordinances that I am teaching you to observe. There's something about explaining and unpacking and teaching and articulating what the law means. In verse 6, we read about observing diligently. That's diligently both in terms of making sure we keep on doing it, but also diligently in terms of, are we understanding the law in the first place? There are parts of the law which I do not believe we are meant to keep in the same way that the people of Israel were. Does that mean I'm saying we can cut out some of the law? No, it's saying that in a different context, with a different culture, we need to carefully interpret the law. That may sound contradictory. I don't think it is. I think it's about us taking seriously the responsibility to carry on what it was that Moses was doing here. Moses was saying, you've had the law given to you already. That happened at Mount Sinai. Now as we enter the land, I'm going to explain to you what that law needs to look like today. The law hasn't changed. The way that God hasn't changed. The way he wants people to live at its rock, at its core, has not changed. We need to understand it for a new day. That doesn't mean we are governed and guided and ruled by what the culture of the day wants. It means that we need to look at the world we live in, and we need to understand how it is right to live within it. We can't undo the law, but we do need to apply the law. Interestingly, we're going to be spending an evening on the 14th of May exploring that question of how we handle the law bits of Deuteronomy and the law bits of the Bible as a whole, and how we do work out which bits are we still meant to live by that letter of the law, which bits are we meant to unpack and understand and apply in a different way. But there is part of the responsibility of a Christian to be making sure we understand God's commands. He doesn't want us to act like robots. You input something into me and I will output an action. He wants us to be understanding and processing. He wants us to be interpreting things. The Bible is a complicated book. He's given it to us so that we can wrestle with it and understand how he wants us to live in the world. And this could all sound a bit dull. This could all sound a bit heavy and boring. Don't like obedience. Don't like the hard work of having to figure out how it is I'm meant to live in the first place. And actually there's some things in my life that I'd rather keep the way they were. But this is the exciting bit, because if the law is about, if obedience is about us the whole of us keeping the whole law, what was the last thing I said? So that we can present the whole of God to our world. Obedience is not just about you and me and stopping there. Obedience to God's law makes us more effective at showing the world who Jesus is. That's why the law was given. Why do I say that? In verse 6 to 8, we read this. You must observe these laws then diligently, For this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as the entire law that I'm setting before you today? For the people, they were being told, when you go into this land, there are going to be other nations who are looking at you. And if you follow these laws, if you live in this way, which is totally different from the way that they're living, totally different from the things that guide them, they will look at you and go, hey, this life works. The people never quite managed it fully enough. The people never quite got there, but this was the purpose of their obedience. The purpose of their obedience wasn't just so that they had to do a certain thing. It was so that other people would notice. What would they notice? Well, the first was this. Wisdom and discernment in verse 6. I believe that God's very wise. I believe that the laws he gives us, the things he asks us to do are good. Why do I say that? He made the world. He knows how it works. He knows what makes it tick. He knows what makes us tick. He knows what is good for humanity far better than humanity knows itself. And if we were to ever truly live completely as he intended, our life would look so completely beautiful to other people. Because they would see something. They would see a contentment when the rest of the world is striving. They would see a generosity when the rest of the world can be stingy. They would see a focus on other people instead of just looking after number one. They would see people who are whole and who are complete and who are not going after things that are actually very self-destructive. And it would be good. That's the opportunity that the people of Israel had and sadly missed. It's also the opportunity that we have. If someone comes around for dinner and you cook them a nice meal and they really enjoy it, what's a question they might ask? Something like, can I see the recipe? Where did you get that from? I've heard about people talking into who are in the world of business and commerce, walking into a company and something about the culture just being so different and so good and so whole and a place where they want to be, that they said that they would say things like, where did you get the ideas for this? What sort of management books are you reading? Whose leadership, whose coaching are you going after? When we think about any part of our life, when someone sees it and they like it, what do they ask? How can I do it too? Where can I get that from? How can I cook that same meal? How can I create the same culture for me? I look at Chris and Celia and I think, how can Natalie and I learn from them? What is it that's guided their marriage? I want a bit of that too. When we live in obedience with God's laws, it's not because God is a boring taskmaster. It's because he wants us to show the world what he's like. When people see us living in a wise and discerning way, they'll assume that the God we serve is wise and discerning. A couple of other things quickly that it shows the world. It's a God who's near. It is the presence of God. These people were living in a tangible, living relationship with God, mediated through the law, mediated through people like Moses and then the priests, but God was near to them. When we, in a world that so often people have this sort of grappling around, trying to grasp hold of something that they can hold on to, we have a God who is near, who we can experience, who we can, as we've done this morning, spend time in his presence. That is attractive. And in verse 8, what other nation has statutes as just as this entire law? God is a God of justice. We should be a people of justice. We should be the people most passionately pursuing the rights of those who don't have them. We should be the people most passionately pursuing the future and the healing of people who need it. God's heart is just. We're actually going to explore that in more detail in a few weeks' time. God is just. When we live according to his ways, we will display his justice to the world, and that is attractive. But here's the thing. We have to be obedient for it to work. God's law being good doesn't mean the world will see it. God's law being lived in us will mean the people will see it. Jesus came to fulfill that law. He lived it perfectly. Jesus then died and in some ways released us from some of the requirements of the law, but never the heart of who God is. If anything, the bar is even raised for us. We are living all of this having seen it lived in the life of Jesus. We are people who, Jewish or not, need to follow the heart of God and need to be obedient to whatever he says to us so the world can see what he is like. So the question I want to finish with is, will this remain as just an idea? This whole series is called Choose Life. It's not just called life. This message this morning is called Choose Obedience. Not just obedience. We have to be willing to choose. Here's some things that our obedience does. Our obedience shows our loyalty to God. In verse 2, you must neither add anything to what I command, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God. And in verse 4, it talks about people who didn't keep God's commands, and then people who held fast to the Lord. Not just the law, but the Lord. Loyalty to God's commands is a sign of loyalty to God himself. This is how God asks his people to behave. The question is, are we willing to be obedient? Are we willing to be obedient to the New Testament's teaching, to the Old Testament's teaching, to the prompting and guiding of the Spirit? Are we willing to be obedient to the call to go and make disciples of all nations? If we're not, it doesn't just show we're not obedient to the things God has asked us to do. It's a lack of obedience to him. There's also something about our obedience and consequences for it. It's slightly contradictory, it seems, because in verse 1, it talks about obey these things so that you may live to enter and occupy the land. And then in verse 4, it talks about the land, in verse 5, it talks about observing these in the land that you're about to enter. Well, which is it? You have to observe them in order to enter the land, or you're going to enter the land and then you observe these laws. Well, in some senses, it's both. At this point in their history, the land is promised. They are going to be given it. That's always been true because God promised to Abraham that it would be given. But they've been wandering around for 40 years not entering the land because they were disobedient to God. There was a consequence for that disobedience. God has now said, that is done. That is over. And you are now about to enter the land. But the degree to which they could enjoy the land, the degree to which they could be effective in the land, that is dependent upon their obedience. And in verse 9, that phrase, take care. This is an attitude of the will. This is something that we have to decide to do, that we have to choose, and we have to keep on choosing. We have to keep on choosing whether we want to be in the driving seat of our life and let God be in the passenger seat, or the other way around. Have to keep on deciding whether we are going to let him be the ultimate authority in our life, or whether we want to maintain that slot for ourselves. I said that this was about how much they would be able to enjoy and be effective in the land. I do not want anyone to hear me saying, because it's not what I'm saying, that if we aren't obedient to God in this area of our life, or if we keep this section of our life off limits to him, if we are in some way disobedient, I don't want anyone to hear me saying that we're going to be robbed of our salvation, that we're going to have that taken away from us, that suddenly our place in heaven is going to be called into question. We have been given the gift of life by Jesus as a gift. And that's what it is. It is his grace. It was never because of our doing. It was never because we earned it. It was always because of him. Just like the people being given the land. The question is, how much are we going to be effective in the life that he's given us? How much are we going to thrive and flourish as disciples and as people of God? And I believe that this question of obedience is an important thing for the church in the whole of the West to get right. Because broadly, the culture in the West has become, if you want to do it, do it. If it suits you, do it. If it'll make you happy, go for it. That's not the life that God calls us to. God does not call us to a life where we get to be masters of our own destiny. God calls us to a life where we say, here's my destiny, God, and give it to him. Ask what he wants. When Jesus said to his disciples, what we now know as the Great Commission, what was it? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations. That's our job. That's our task. Baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have taught you. Part of the journey of becoming a disciple is making a decision to obey Jesus. Part of the life of living as a disciple is continuing to obey Jesus. And part of helping other people to come to know Jesus is an invitation to submit their lives to obedience to him as well. Obedience to God is a linchpin in our church's life, in our own lives, in the life of any Christian disciple and any Christian community. Who is going to be in the driving seat? It may be that this morning you're sitting here and thinking, this sounds great, but actually I don't know how it is that God wants me to live. I don't really know what these laws are. I don't really know what the best way to live is. That's fine. That's okay. We can help with that. There's the Bible, and we can help you to know how to grapple with it so that we can respect the whole integrity of what God is saying, but also interpret it so that we know what that might mean for us. If that's something that you want to know how to do better, please come and have a conversation. We can talk. If you're thinking, actually there's something in my life and I know what obedience would look like, but it's really hard, I want to say that's okay as well, because this isn't necessarily going to be easy. But it's also something we want to journey with you in. We want to help you. We want to support you. What I don't want anyone to leave today feeling is in some way condemned, or in some way feeling as though you're not good enough because you know that there's been disobedience in your life. Jesus knew that. That was part of the deal. That's why he died for you. That's why he rose again for you. But I want each of you, here or joining online, to know how releasing it can be to give the keys of our life to God, to let him be in the driving seat, to let him be the master, and for us to be obedience. I want to pray for us, and I'm going to ask the band to come back, and then we're going to sing a song which encapsulates a lot of what I've been talking about. Father, I want to ask that you would help us to feel appropriately the weight of the call to obedience. The call that you gave to your people, Israel, the call that you gave through your son, Jesus, the call that you still give to us, each of us. Would you help us to feel the heaviness of that responsibility? But would you also, by your Spirit's work within us, give us a lightness as we know that you only ever command what is best, that you only ever command what is right. Help us to live obediently to you and joyful in that obedience. We want to be people who are known for being yours. We want to be people who, when others meet us, they say, where did you get that life from? How did you become who you are? Lord, would you fashion that in us? And as we take a step of obedience now, would you help us to know that you are pleased? We're going to sing a song which contains the words, I surrender all. I don't know if that's ever been true when I've sung it. I'm sure it's been far more true for me to sing something like, I surrender some, or much, or lots, or maybe just little. For me this morning, this is a statement of intent. This is where I want to be. This is where I want to get to. And I'm going to ask God to lead me each step of the way until I can say truly, honestly, I surrender all to you.